purpose of this conversation actually to share with you our experience in the automotive industry in Asia, and very briefly about ourselves. Intralink is a global company. I've been working in Asia for the last 30 years, since the 1990s. The headquarters is in Oxford. It's a British company. And actually what we do is mainly business development and sales for Western companies who wish to penetrate the Asian markets. We concentrate on 4 countries: China, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. And we have about 90 people located in our offices. All of them are multilingual. All of them speak the local language and English. And it's a mixture of local people who were born in the same country, studied in the UK and the US, and also Westerners who speak the language. Most of our people are more than 10 years in the company. And together with me is Tommy, which is the head of Automotive and Mobility. He will lead the entire presentation. He has a huge experience in this sector. We spent about 11 years in China, involved with many deals, and connected with, let's say, the top players in this industry. Another point on top of what we do for Western companies, we also do projects for Asian corporates who look for technologies in the West. So we do scouting projects and sometimes help them to define strategy in different topics. So this is more or less about us. And Tommy, would you like to introduce yourselves and take it forward?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much, Eran, and thank you everyone for dialing in at different hours. I guess most of everyone else is based in Israel, so you guys are dialing in late in your day. Appreciate it. For myself personally, I'm based in San Jose, California, so just getting started over here. Eran basically gave the high level of who I am, 11 plus years on the ground in Asia. Most of that time spent with Intralink and really focused on the automotive and mobility sector. Today, I'm in North America, focused on supporting Western companies really develop and plan their strategies for Northeast Asia with a particular focus, again, on automotive and mobility. Just a couple of quick housekeeping items before I jump into the presentation. First, we are recording this, so just wanted to let you know that in advance. And there's a chance we will be able to share the recording after the fact. Second, we will definitely have time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. So the chat feature is enabled at this time, so you can feel free to put any questions inside the chat, or you can raise your hand simply at the end of the presentation, and we can do it that way. But it's not a huge amount of people here, so hopefully we'll have a bit of a discussion or debate at the end. So with that, I'll jump right into it. Just to get started, to talk about some of our clients in the sector. So just quickly, we've worked across really the case technologies: connected, autonomous, shared, and electric in Asia over really the last 10 years, I would say. Prior to that, we spent a lot less time in the cutting edge of the automotive world, at least for how we define it today. Earlier on, we were much more focused on industrial type technologies in the automotive segment. Today, frankly, everything we do more or less is somewhere within the case ecosystem. So very much what Asia is looking for and very much what Western startups have to offer. I'm sure some of you may recognize a couple of names. Obviously, Regulus Cyber is both on the call and a past client of ours. Also out of Israel, of course, is Vire, which provides a 4D imaging solution both for public transport, in-cabin passenger monitoring, as well as a few other non-automotive applications. And finally, DriveView Auto, which does teleoperation for level 4 and level 5 autonomous vehicles. In terms of who we sell to in Asia, our day job is we're out there in front of the entire ecosystem, which of course is the OEMs, but frankly, we spend a lot of time with other players, so tier ones, as well as other technology companies based in Asia. So it's not just going into Toyota and talking with the folks at Toyota because they're the biggest OEM in Japan and the #1 target. In many cases, to do a deal with Toyota, you have to spend a lot of time with the tier ones, in many cases with other technology companies, depending on the solution, with the telco, with the infrastructure partner, whoever it might be. So nonetheless, we've done deals across the board with the OEMs, with the tiers, and plenty of existing and frankly rising stars in the automotive sector, because more and more companies are now entering the space that aren't traditionally in the sector. To talk about the market in Northeast Asia, which we define as China, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, it's a very important part of the world. To take a step back, it's 3 of the world's top 10 economies, 20% of the world's population, and 3 of the top 5 patent leaders in terms of registrations today. So we're talking about very important economies, 38% of Fortune 500 companies, government spending across the board in all areas of R&D, and that trickles, of course, into the private sector as well. In a place like China, which is where I spent most of my time, it has really evolved in an impressive way over the last 10 years. It used to be made in China for as cheap as possible. These days, it's innovated in China. So it's very much becoming an innovation center, and automotive certainly is a big part of that. Ford today, GM and others have big innovation centers based in China. So it's not just US R&D, but it's global R&D today. But these regions and these countries are quite similar and quite different. It's not just one territory. So China, in fact, and Japan and Korea are very different. They have, of course, different types of companies, different challenges. And in fact, they also have many similar challenges. Big corporates, in many cases, a lack of transparency within these corporates. We're often told that our clients have been in a deep conversation with somebody at an OEM, and they think it's the decision maker, but it turns out it's someone who just speaks English the best. And in fact, they have no decision-making authority. So very much different challenges, and I think as an extension of that, the same needs. They all more or less want somebody who speaks their language. They want somebody local who's based in that time zone who they can talk to, and somebody who I think is there to help guide them through the entire sales cycle. So very much a region with similarities as well. Heading into the automotive market, again, it's a 30 million vehicle market, which is the whole reason that I think we're here today. Impressive markets, China with 25 million vehicles, Japan with 4.5 million, and South Korea with approaching 2 million vehicles per year. China, of course, has been the world's biggest market for many years now, and it's actually positioning itself to dominate, not just in electric vehicles, but also autonomous vehicles, fuel cell vehicles, etc. Japan, in its own right, is an important market, bigger than Germany, bigger than India. So I was surprised, of course, when Japan passed Germany, and obviously in 2020, it maintained its position there as the world's #3. And South Korea, a bigger automotive market than France, UK, or Russia. So again, Korea doing some really great work led by Hyundai, of course. And within Asia, there's also a population crisis. So there's not enough workers, period. It's particularly a challenge in Japan and Korea, China as well for certain types of work, and certainly on the factory front, China has a population crisis. So Asia is looking at different technologies, either to bring in from the West or to help them support with automation, et cetera. So very much I think, opportunities in that part of the world. And the government is continuing to fund and making strategic investments in startups. So definitely, I think, critical to looking at Asia. And I would really classify Asia in two ways. There's opportunities in Asia, which would mean selling to a company like Toyota for work in Japan, but also with Asia, which is to say that if you do a deal with Toyota in Japan or Hyundai in Korea, it's not just a domestic deal, but it's actually a global deal, which is to say, if we look at the chart here, we see that Japan, while they're selling around 5 million vehicles per annum domestically, Japanese OEMs globally are doing more than 20 million in sales around the world. So a deal with a Japanese OEM or a tier one very much should have a global outlook to it, as with Korea. China, on the other hand, is quite the inverse. China has a very, very big domestic market, of course, but domestic OEMs in China are doing not a whole lot in terms of global sales. They have that vision, of course, but they're not there yet. But in 10, 20 years, I think it'll be a very different world, and perhaps we'll all be driving Chinese branded cars in 20 years' time. We shall see. Asia, of course, is leading the way with CASE technologies. Just to touch on each four of the pillars quickly, and then we'll get into it in a bit more detail in a minute. Connected cars is a really hot area in Asia. 5G, of course, has underpinned that, and telcos are working very closely with the private sector. We see 5G being rolled out in Asia much faster than elsewhere in the world, and that's really led to a particular boom with connected cars. In terms of autonomous, the government has, again, given a lot of support. Comparing autonomous cars, at least to the challenges we face here in the US, where we have the federal government in Washington and we have state governments, and they don't always agree with each other on certain issues, it seems that the US has really struggled to have autonomous car testing rolled out in mass production or in mass quantity around the country. However, in a place like China, where the Beijing government can give its vision to the provincial governments, everyone seems to be working together much better, and we see a lot of inter-provincial testing of L4 and L5 autonomous vehicles, which is quite important to get miles logged on the road. In the shared space, I would say Asia is a slightly younger industry, perhaps, to what we see elsewhere in the world. Ride sharing and ride hailing are, of course, the two pillars in this space. Ride sharing in particular, I think, is an interesting area, more so in Japan and Korea than in China. In the ride hailing side of things, COVID is more or less back to normal in Asia, so rides have resumed. So again, while Uber and Lyft are struggling here in the US, companies like Didi in China are more or less back to normal business out there. And finally, in the electric side, Asia, in my view, is ground zero, maybe with Tesla, perhaps BMW and Audi as the exceptions. Asia is really leading the charge there. China, obviously, at the tip of the spear with 40% of EV sales last year. And it's also not just the vehicle itself, it's also the entire supply chain. Battery production is also really taking place in Asia, as is the core R&D for next generation lithium-ion batteries. So next, I'm going to talk about the China market and break that down for everyone, and then I'll do the same for Japan and South Korea. So China, of course, is the world's biggest market. I remember going back to 2009, which was actually the first time that China entered the top market, and it beat out the US, and it was massive news, although everyone seemed to say, well, the Chinese cars are dangerous, and at the time they were very different. They were, barely street legal, at least by Western standards. Today, it's a completely different market with high-end vehicles and vehicles with top-of-the-line features that we don't necessarily think of when we think of the China cars of 10, 20 years ago. The market since 2009 has more than doubled, and it's peaked out in 2017 with almost 29 million vehicle sales. Today, China, of course, it's dominated by joint ventures that are manufacturing. They're still the market leader in terms of sales, and I'll talk about them in a minute. But domestic brands are on the rise, and in fact, we see domestic brands representing more market share within China, growing up to 27% in 2020 for companies like BYD and Geely and others. China, of course, today is the EV market leader. but fuel cells, in my opinion, are positioned to take off in China with government support and subsidies. And there's plenty of opportunities despite China's population, despite their R&D, and despite the fact that they're registering a ton of patents around the world. China still needs help. And the areas that we see from the OEMs and the tiers that they're looking at different Western technology companies and startups in particular, it includes high-end perception. So SLAM in particular is quite interesting. Camera only distant measurements is quite interesting, and any sort of software built into the sensor stack is something where China needs help. Certainly on the lithium-ion battery material and battery safety side of things. And finally, in the semiconductor side, which of course is in the news quite a bit today for the wrong reasons, having a bit of a chipset crunch, but China does need help with mobile data centers and system-on-chip type technologies to really handle the deep processing for autonomous and next generation vehicles. So to break down the market into three different pillars, I suppose, and this is quite important because there's more than 100 OEMs in China. So when a technology company says to me, I'm interested in the China market, the key question is, well, who do you target? When do you target them? And where's the greatest upside? Where is the risk, etc.? Of course, if we go left to right, looking at the Sino-foreign JVs, these are the companies that have the highest volumes today. Forecasts are more or less stable. If they say the platform is going to sell 500,000 cars, we more or less take that at face value, plus or minus whatever percentage we would apply to it for a normal forecast. And we believe that these companies, in fact, have pretty long sales cycles. So not atypical from working with Nissan or BMW elsewhere in the world. We would expect a similar type of sales cycle in a place like China. In terms of mature domestic OEMs, these are names like BYD and Geely and Great Wall, etc. These are somewhere in the middle. I would say their forecasts are relatively stable, sales cycles perhaps a bit faster as they're scrambling to take on the joint ventures and position themselves as the future of the Chinese automotive market. And then finally on the far right are the new energy OEMs, which of course are the ones we read about in the news more or less every day, companies like NIO and XPeng and Li Auto. These are companies that, in my view, are the highest amount of risk in working with them, but obviously they have a really high ceiling because today a company like XPeng might be making 10,000 cars a year or whatever, or a month, whatever it is. But in fact, longer term, their vision is to do millions of cars. Their vision is to export around the world. And in fact, one company in particular, some of you might know, called iWays, has already exported 1,000 EVs to Israel. So we do see companies out of China, particularly on the new energy side, already exporting overseas. So that's more or less how I break down the market. I think the important comment to make is that these deals are all negotiated in China. So even if you're supplying today to BMW or to Honda or to Volkswagen or whoever it is, if you want to do a deal in China, you have to go to China to do that deal. It's not just a question of getting out there and saying we've done a deal and can we just get kicked across and sell the same widget for $1 in China. In fact, you have to renegotiate. There's different agreements, different contracts, and different terms that you might have to agree to in the domestic market. So very much so, it's important to go on the ground in China. In terms of Japan, it's a steady market and it's a conservative market. Cars, however, are replaced every 9 or so years. So what we believe is that by the time 2030 comes about, there'll be more or less half of the cars in Japan will have some sort of case functionality. And we believe about 30 million of those will be passenger vehicles, maybe 10 million or so will be commercial vehicles. Japan has different car classes, certainly than in the US and Europe. The market's dominated with what's called a K car or a mini car. So it's a much smaller vehicle, much lower cost. In many cases, some of the features are stripped down a bit to keep it price sensitive. But again, even K cars are looking at electrifying and putting in different next generation features as well. Japan has a ton of famous tier ones, Denso, Hitachi Auto, Panasonic, Aisin, names that you guys know. In fact, I think 27 of the top 100 tiers are sitting in Japan. And just to contextualize those numbers, the US has 18, Germany has 18, China and South Korea both have 6. So really, in terms of talking with tiers in Japan, it also represents a really strong global potential for your business if you can get a few Japanese tier ones really interested in your technology. But of course, the OEM is the other half of the equation, and you also have to create the push-pull that everyone, I think, here is somewhat familiar with. And finally, in Japan, semiconductors are back. Japan, of course, dominated semiconductors in the 2000s and lost out quite a bit to Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. Today, it's coming back, and actually Toyota a couple of years ago made a few investments in this space, one in particular, a joint venture with Denso. And today, Toyota seems to be the OEM that is best positioned, if not the only OEM, well positioned to weather the entire semiconductor crisis. So we shall see how that plays out, but certainly an area I'm watching with a lot of interest as the semiconductor crisis continues on and Toyota seems to have their chipsets more or less buttoned up. In terms of opportunities, a lot of government investment into autonomous vehicles. The mobility as a service market is quite important, certainly on car sharing and ride sharing, but also on the public transport side as well. And finally, Japan is more or less committed to banning internal combustion engines by the mid-2030s. So we expect EVs to grow rapidly within Japan. And finally, in South Korea, it's basically a one horse race in the sense that Hyundai-Kia Genesis is dominating the market. They've sold basically 70% of the entire market in 2020, and obviously they're the leading OEM from South Korea in terms of global sales, more than 6 million sold by the group in 2020. There's a few other players that we talk to regularly. Sanyong would be one, Renault, Samsung would be the other, but really Hyundai is where everybody sets their targets more or less. There's a bunch of different interesting tier ones out of South Korea. Mobis, Mondo, Kakao, which is in the internet space, but dabbling in automotive as well, would be a few. And then, of course, Samsung and LG would be the others, focused today more so on infotainment applications, but also expanding out into other areas. The government has invested a ton into case technologies, in particular for automotive. They've invested and built out something called Case City, which is an 88-acre proving ground for autonomous vehicles. It's twice the size of the Detroit equivalent, which I think is called M-City. So in fact, you can just argue that Korea and Asia in particular is really putting a ton of money and a ton of focus into what it needs to do to really dominate the automotive sector in the future. And then finally, I think we see that there's a late start in certain areas, but despite the late start, maybe in autonomous vehicles, for example, we see companies coming back and really making a strong push to become market leaders, both in L4 and L5 autonomous, but also connected cars as well. Korea does need help, certainly on the sensor side, software in particular, and also in the fuel cell side, which alongside China and Japan, I think are very well positioned to take off and dominate. Anything on either the fuel cell itself, the stack, or also the fueling and the infrastructure side of things are all of interest to South Korea. So we're going to now focus not just on individual countries, but actually on technology verticals. So I'll walk through each of the case technologies and then more or less wrap up with a couple of slides and open it up to questions and answers. So to get started, focusing on connected cars in China, there's immediate plans for V2X cars in China. Half of the new cars by 2025 will have some sort of V2X functionality, and some cars actually as soon as next year. So very much on the short-term roadmap. Not to say that it's too late, but certainly things are moving in the V2X space in China. So any company involved there should certainly make a move sooner than later. Autotalks, of course, is a well-known Israeli company, and they've been active in China for some years now and have actually won a couple of deals to provide chipsets for mass production vehicles in China. but the country itself still needs some help with connectivity, with latency and improving latency for connected cars, and then certainly in the IVI space as well. Going into Japan, connected cars have been around for quite a while, I think 5 years at this point. Most of the OEMs are going to have full connectivity for their fleets, Nissan being a really good example of that. You also see Japanese tier 1s working in China. So there's certainly an intra-Asia angle as well. So Alps being a prime example, working in Northeast China on a V2X deployment. The key question, of course, is do you talk to Alps in Japan for the China deal, or do you talk to them in China for the China deal? And I think, frankly, it's probably a combination of the two. But nonetheless, it's important that you keep in mind that a deal with a company in Japan, again, while it could be a deal in the West as well, it also might lead to some business in China for your company. And the OEMs today, they're working together on interoperability. So certainly it's nice to see companies sitting down and co-developing how they're going to have their devices communicate in the future. Japan does have a couple of challenges that the government is concerned about. The first, of course, is the security angle. So how do we prevent hacking? How do we prevent anything else where vehicles could be taken over and used for the wrong purpose, perhaps? And there's been some notorious cases, certainly in the US, of vehicle hacking. So I think Japan is looking quite closely at those. And then on the data privacy side of things. So how do we control the data privacy for passengers as cars are connected and getting fed back to data centers in the cloud, et cetera. And finally, in South Korea, telcos have been working very closely with OEMs. The ecosystem is very committed and networks have been rolled out. So LoRaWAN, as an example, was rolled out by SKT nationwide across the country. And as the next step to that, all cars made by HKMC are going to be connected as quickly as 2025. So certainly a bold goal, but I think they'll get there. The government was a bit slow, I think, in South Korea compared to their counterparts in terms of rolling out connected car technologies. And it was because of the wait and see approach, I think the private sector maybe put less focus into connected cars up until a point. So certainly it's worth for companies to understand that and maybe go out and meeting with some of the telcos who in fact all have smart mobility teams today. For autonomous vehicles, I think this is an area that gets a lot of buzz. Nobody's really sure how it's going to play out, but certainly today, everybody seems to be investing in this space and really pushing the envelope in terms of building out platforms, doing on-road testing, and really as many trials, some with humans and cars as possible. So in China today, L3 vehicles are immediately being planned. NIO, Chery, Geely, and others are all focused in the space. We see AGVs being used in last mile delivery and for on-road type applications. So again, e-commerce companies are looking at this and actually utilizing this today. And LiDAR is actually already implemented into a couple of Chinese cars. The first was made by NIO, and then just recently, I think it was last month, at the Shanghai EV Expo, XPeng introduced a car, I think they called it the P5, which has a built-in LiDAR technology. So again, we're talking about an embedded LiDAR, not a hockey puck spinning around on the roof, but actually embedded and built into the car. So really exciting to see China doing that. We have companies like Baidu, which is an internet giant, working with all the OEMs on next generation autonomous applications. Huawei, of course, which is known for its consumer and telecoms business, is also throwing itself into the ring as a big autonomous vehicle tier 1 supplier, as is DJI, which is a drone company, and really drones are their heritage, but again, they're jumping in as a tier 1 as well. China does need help, certainly with SLAM, LiDAR type technologies, and then again, anything on the semicon side is where China's looking west for any sort of innovative technologies that can help them out developing AVs as fast as possible. Next, over into Japan, L2 was already out on the road. In fact, the first level 3 autonomous car is also out on the roads in Japan. It's a Honda car called the Legend. It was a limited release, but again, it's being driven by normal people on normal Japanese streets. So quite exciting to see that. The L4 plan for Japan is 2025. But again, despite commitments from Toyota, Honda, and Nissan, there's concerns around data privacy. So we'll have to see if, in fact, the government regulatory angle will eventually slow down the innovation of the OEMs in tiers. I think not. I think probably the latter. I think the innovation by the OEMs and the ecosystem will push the government to come up with solutions and plans for data privacy rather than the inverse. And finally, there's a lot of investment happening in Japan for different autonomous vehicle technologies. Just recently, of course, Lyft's self-driving unit was bought by Woven, which is the Toyota Smart City project, of course, located near Mount Fuji for more than $500 million. Japan, with the population crunch, is looking at all different ways to bring in technology, and acquisition investment is certainly one alongside licensing. And finally, in South Korea, we see L4 platforms more or less should be on the road by next year and commercialized by 2024. So definitely some strong plans for Korea. There's a lot of interesting OEMs and tier ones working on this. On the tier one side, Naver and Mondo and others are definitely doing some really interesting work. And finally, South Korea does need help, again, on the software side of things in the sensor space. So the hardware side is one angle, but of course the perception is the other angle, and Korea definitely is looking overseas at different solutions for the latter. Next, into shared vehicles. So in China, I would say it's much more of a ride-hailing ecosystem than it is a car-sharing ecosystem. The reason the latter, I think, is less popular is car sharing is really just not part of the cultural norm in China. In China, it's important to own a car. Some might argue it's a requirement for getting married. So most people prefer to buy a car, even if it's a cheap vehicle domestically made, rather than go after a car share and rent a car for a day a week when needed type of thing. In the ride-hailing side, Didi, Chuxing, of course, is the biggest in China. They've acquired Uber's China assets. That was 5+ years ago, I believe. And today they're doing per annum more than 1 billion trips a year outside of China. So it's a global company. And they actually set the record for the most trips in a day by a ride-hailing platform with 50 million trips. In fact, this was on Chinese Valentine's Day, but just an eye-popping number to think about that. That's the amount of rides being given through a platform in a single day in a single country. Today, we see a lot of interest for customized solutions for these vehicles. So in fact, companies like Didi are trying to optimize and streamline different vehicles that work best on their platform. Just overnight, Guangzhou Automotive, they have an EV subsidiary called Ion, and they announced that they're working with Didi for an autonomous EV. So that's just one example, but there's numerous other OEMs that are working closely with Didi and the other ride-sharing platforms in China. In terms of Japan, ride-sharing is actually a lot more limited, and that's primarily due to government regulations. We see, in fact, that a company like Uber is more or less an online way to book a taxi. So taking taxi companies into the 21st century, perhaps, and using your phone to book the taxi, but it's not the Uber that we're familiar with here in the West. Car sharing is actually a lot more popular, particularly in bigger cities, where people in Tokyo might want to take a weekend trip, but don't want to pay for a car, and certainly finding parking in a limited environment. But there's obviously been some decline with COVID, but that's more or less back on the rise. And finally, Japan, not surprisingly, is looking into air taxi services. And why wouldn't Japan or perhaps Korea lead the charge in a futuristic technology like that? It just makes a ton of sense that they're pushing the envelope yet again in the public transport side of things. And finally, in Korea, both car and ride-hailing are quite popular. SoCar is the leader in the car sharing side of the house. Kakao Mobility, which again comes from the internet giant, is leading on the ride-hailing side. And the government really is supporting both of these because they're green policies, and the government is all about green technology and sees both of these as more, shall we say, green than perhaps individuals going out and buying their own cars and finding places to park them, etc. And finally, into electric vehicles, China is the world leader, 42% of sales in 2020 with 1.3 million cars sold. You have some really impressive rankings in terms of the lithium-ion battery ecosystem, and even further upstream in terms of the rare earth materials that are going into the batteries. So China is really vertically integrated in the EV segment. 5 of the top 10 EV battery makers are based in China, and they're innovating and they're globalizing. And on the globalization front, we see companies like CATL setting up factories in Europe, which again, they're betting both on 2 things. 1, EVs taking off in Europe and supporting customers there. And 2, I think Chinese EV OEMs going into Europe and setting up their own factories, which again, will build out the ecosystem, because if they can supply to them in China, it's a much faster turnkey solution to also supply to them in a place like Europe. That said, only 20% of auto sales will be EVs in China by 2025. So a slightly lower ceiling as a percentage basis, perhaps, than Japan and Korea. But again, the numbers are going to be a lot more interesting when you're talking about 25 million cars and 20% of those cars becoming electric. And within China, the top selling EV, I'd be surprised if anybody's heard of this OEM, but it's an OEM called Wuling, and the Hongguang Mini is the best seller. It sells for $4.4 thousand. So again, we're not talking about a Tesla competitor, so to speak. Companies like NIO and XPeng are trying to be the Tesla killer. I would say Wuling is not, but again, it's fascinating to see that they're also doing very well at the low-end segment, and some of that, of course, is underpinned by government subsidies. And the fact that you can get a license plate in China much faster if you purchase an electric vehicle, and in a big city like Beijing or Shanghai, where license plates can cost more than the car, $10,000, $12,000 just to get your license slapped on the back of your vehicle. Getting a license plate a bit faster and a bit cheaper is quite important. And finally, we see a lot of opportunities for Israeli companies, certainly on the efficiency side of things, so battery efficiency, vehicle efficiency, BMS, battery safety. Those are areas that China needs help in and is looking all over the world for solutions. Next, into Japan, we see a lot of interest. Again, passenger vehicles and EVs by 2030 should be more or less going electric. The entire Honda fleet by 2040 will be electric. Panasonic is the world's biggest lithium-ion battery maker, and charging is also an issue. So infrastructure is important, particularly in the rural segments and countryside. And finally, in South Korea, it's a young market. Again, they're really strong both at the OEM level and going upstream into batteries. LG Chem, SKI, and Samsung SDI are all leading the charge in the lithium-ion side of things. The government is very much pro-electric vehicle, but also very much pro-fuel cell. So anything fuel cell related would be quite interesting, I think, for South Korea, everything from the stack on upstream. So I think finally, I'll just touch quickly on some best practices, and then we can open it up to questions. It's important to have a local presence in Asia. No matter what you do, if you want to do a deal, you have to have a team on the ground, people on the ground to do the running for you. That's the first comment. The second is you need to localize your product. It can be the features, it can be language, pricing, etc. And you need direct feedback from your customers before you localize. But if you have a product with 5 USPs and the OEM or tier 1 only wants 1 or 2 of those USPs, then you need to think, is it worth going after, and should we actually sell a dumbed down version of our product, because that's what they're looking for in Asia, and flip our model on our head. So very much important, and in fact what Asia wants is going to be completely different in a sense than what Europe or the US or elsewhere is looking for. Technical support is very important to have on the ground. Again, you can deal with engineer to engineer through Zoom and Skype and the rest, but there's going to be a point where you need to invest in technical resource on the ground. Generally speaking, that's part of kind of the 6 to 12 month plan. You should have an open mind. It's not just about the OEMs. They're the biggest names, of course, and the nicest logos to have. But in many cases, we've done deals really with tier ones that weren't on our clients' radar to start, but very much a faster and more effective way to do the deal. And the final point is there's no silver bullets to Asia. You have to have a long-term view. Nothing happens overnight. We have a great network. A lot of people have a great network. You can find people on LinkedIn very quickly, but really the network is just the start. You have to have a process, you have to be diligent, and you have to be committed. So unless you have a long-term view of at least 12 months, if not longer, for automotive to Asia and to building your business, I think you need to kind of reconsider if it's the market for you or the right time for your company. Not to say you can't do a proof of concept in a few months, but really to get into mass production, you need to have a long-term outlook. So I think that's where I'll leave it for now. I'm happy to open it up to questions. I appreciate, again, the opportunity to speak, and obviously to everyone listening in. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. I will be glad to ask some questions.
Please, go ahead.
First of all, can you say a few words about Singapore and the language they speak? If how is their English? And also, if you can provide us with some information about the ride sharing potential. How do you see the potential specifically with respect to kids rides? What do you think in those areas?
So I'll take your questions in order. Thank you. So for Singapore, we of course don't have a team there, and we don't focus there. That said, it's a very Western culture, and they're very Westernized just in terms of how they do business. So from a language capability, everyone speaks English. And I think that's one of the reasons we haven't set up there. It's just not nearly as challenging for a Western company to navigate a corporation in Singapore for many of those reasons. In terms of your latter question, in terms of the kids' safety side, I think that is quite important. Kids' safety is perhaps viewed slightly differently in Asia. I know that in a place like Japan, and probably elsewhere, we see kids taking the subway actually to school or biking to school by themselves from the age of 6 or 7, which probably in the US we wouldn't do as responsible parents, but a slightly different society there, of course. But that said, I think in the safety side and maybe visibility, both kids' safety and perhaps elderly safety with aging populations, both would be interesting markets. Mm-hmm.
Okay, maybe afterwards we should have a one-on-one conversation with respect to our project venture.
I would be happy to. Thank you.
Great.
So if no one else is asking, maybe I'll ask a question.
Can I go ahead first, Vital?
Oh, yeah, sure, go ahead.
Sorry, I was waiting. So thank you very much, Thomas. That was very, very insightful, and definitely as a Chinese, probably I'm the only non-Israeli now sitting in the room and dialing in, but definitely it gives a very nice perspective, and to see how these three major markets are compared side by side. And I want to touch a little bit. I want to hear your opinion on the point that you touched about, working with non-traditional OEMs, but rather those, I guess you can define them as giant tech companies, like Xiaomi, like Oppo, like those Baidu that started entering the world of mobility, from the angle of AV or EV. But what do you think about the workflow with them? Because you mentioned that actually the common issue of working or navigating inside those organizations is actually, it could be very time consuming, and there's lack of transparency, and also you need to have very long patience for everything to go through. Do you think the dynamics there are different? And, do you think it's actually new opportunities for startups actually to start approaching those companies instead of going to traditional OEMs, or the other way?
No, excellent question. I really appreciate it. And and I think a very relevant question actually as well. So in terms of what we see, everybody more or less has an automotive angle today, and the types of companies you mentioned. So the internet giants like Alibaba and Baidu and Tencent, certainly the technology companies going downstream a bit into consumer electronics. Xiaomi just recently announced it's jumping into the EV ring. Even a real estate company called Evergrande is another one. And so you have to kind of ask yourself, I think, two questions. One is, what is the plan of this company? Are they going to make cars? Are they going to become a supplier to the OEMs or to the tier ones? And where does your technology fit into what they're doing? I think traditionally speaking, some of the tech companies may be more focused on consumer or internet, might be because they're newer to automotive, they might be a bit different in their approach, which might mean that one, they could move faster because they just might not go through the same due diligence that another type of company like a Denso or a Bosch might take you through. Having said that, I would be slightly more skeptical of whatever numbers they tell you. If a company like Xiaomi says, here's our plan for electric vehicles and here's our growth trajectory, and it does one of these, well, they've never made a car and they haven't sold any cars. So then the question is, how quickly will they get there and do we believe it? But overall, I'm confident in the ecosystem. If we go back 2 or 3 years, a lot of people, myself included, had conversations about, will NIO make it? Will Li Auto make it? Will XPeng make it? And they're not only here, but they're building factories and they're exporting and this and that. So I think the future is bright, but you do have to take some companies with a grain of salt, perhaps.
Amazing insight. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah.
So, Noah, can I go now?
Yes, please. Sorry for that.
No. Of course. I was just wondering, from the EcoMotion perspective, Noah and me actually were working on connecting, translating content and everything. So I was wondering if communities exist in a way that is similar to what we do here. This is something you can tap into.
Yeah, no, good question. It's I would say across Asia, certainly there's different types of communities and different types of organizations focused on startups, incubators, et cetera. And some of these are coming out of big corporates. So we see really two types. We see traditional automotive OEMs having a venture arm. So Denso, of course, or Toyota, of course, or Hyundai, of course, all have different labs where they collaborate and work closely with startups. We also see perhaps more traditional OEMs in tier ones, and I'll give an example in a second, but scrambling and struggling to figure out how do they tap into case technologies. And a perfect example is there's a tier one in Japan called Sano Industries, and they are a pre-war, pretty old school, traditional Japanese tier one that makes fuel injectors. And we actually facilitated their investment into one of our clients called Solid Power, which is a solid state EV battery company. And Solid Power got the investment from Sano because Sano in particular was struggling to figure out how it works with EVs and what is it going to do in 5-10 years. So very much, I think, opportunities across the board. Yeah.
Evyatar, I think you asked about communities like EcoMotion.
Yes. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be in the same way, but like a designated concept where companies of different sizes can connect, and especially startups and OEMs or tier ones, like startups and big companies. So I know in Japan there are such communities, for example, around energy. Yeah. I'm just wondering how it is generally in Asia.
Okay, yeah, no, understood, and apologies if I misanswered your question. So I do think, yeah, we see some communities like Plug and Play, as an example, is based out there and working closely in the mobility space. So a bit kind of like the EcoMotion model, perhaps, or close to it. So that would be kind of one example. And I think the big corporates today, they're all looking at startups, and they have different ways to tap into those startups. In many cases, they'll have kind of a pitch day or a demo day type of interface where you can go into the corporate, and 10 or 15 startups will have a chance to share what they do. So that's part of it. But I think, I mean, we've seen a little bit less just in terms of, here's an online platform that connects 50 startups to 50 tier ones and OEMs. I don't know if we've come across that as much, but I can certainly check.
I appreciate that. Just just start connecting and exchanging ideas and concepts.
Yeah,
we can talk about it, but.
Yeah, just sharing 2 cents in here. I mean, definitely, I don't represent the whole country, but from what I know, I think at least for China, the community there is definitely less chill and relaxed and less, let's say, fun than EcoMotion. You probably won't find a lot of places where people just have this kind of free conversation and get into workshop, but rather there were more closed door events or conference at higher scale, where they probably more like, working on the way of, delivering a message or PR purposes. On the other hand, there are actually a lot of organizations and platforms and alliances, at least speaking for China. I think Chinese has definitely they are a huge fan of building a platform, even though the platform don't a lot of time come with, some result. But it will be, I think, very helpful to connect with certain platforms. Of course, you need to be careful with, what kind of platform it really is. Does it really does the thing it claims to do? But usually, you will have those, a lot of time those platforms are backed up by governments or other entities that has, shares by certain municipality or government. And it's actually going to be very helpful to get connected through them and then to go to the OEMs individually. But I don't think I think EcoMotion is pretty unicorn from what I remember and what I see in China.
Yeah, agreed with all that.
Thomas, do you have time for maybe another question, or we need to cut off?
Yeah, please go ahead. Sure.
Yeah, I really like how you analyze the opportunities for each market and also per section, per technology wise. And I've noticed, definitely, I knew that for China, but I'm also very happy and surprised to find out it's pretty much similar with Korea and Japan, that all the technologies they are looking for in Israel, in the West, are something, I don't know what's the right term in mobility. It's more something I would call it more hardcore technology. Whereas, here in mobility, in EcoMotion, you see a lot of companies, they're presenting software solution or, something in an app that could be categorized as MarkTech, but they use it in the mobility world, or someone is working on, passenger experience, but more on the not achieved by hardware. Or in general, SaaS solution. Let's say SaaS is something that Israel is very good at, but I have pretty big difficulty, promoting those businesses and ventures in China. So what do you see the chances or the potential for those companies to gain their share in China or in Asia in general?
No, great question. So SaaS, of course, is always a bit of a challenge in China, just from the hosting cloud data privacy perspective, and what is the SaaS doing, and if there's sensitive information, is it allowed in? So certainly, I think having a partner is very important in China on the cloud and hosting side. The same into Japan and Korea as well. But I think, as you're alluding to, some SaaS technologies are general SaaS with a mobility angle. And I think the SaaS that we see the most interest in are built for the mobility sector. So technologies that are used to optimize fleets, technologies used for optimizing driver safety, and the analytics side of that we see a lot of interest in. Software that is used perhaps for the in-vehicle experience, so IVI type software, we see a lot of interest from the tier ones as well. So definitely, I think it's easier to have a conversation with the automotive players if you built something just for automotive rather than this is we can do 50 things and automotive is one of those 50 things.
Totally. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
I personally have to go and see for the other workshops. By the way, everyone here, if you want to move on to another workshop, I can open it up for you. The registration is closed, but the links are available. Eran and Thomas, I want to thank you very much. It was really interesting, especially as I really want, that's my kid. I really want EcoMotion to have more presence in China or Asia in general. And so you really gave me some structure on that, and we'll continue this discussion.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, Aviatar.
Likewise, yes. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you everyone for listening in. Our contact details are, of course, listed here, so feel free to get in touch if you would like a copy of the slides. And obviously, if you have any follow-up questions or to continue the conversation, we would be delighted to do so.